Did you guys learn some good things from Tom this morning?
Yeah.
I thought it'd be very good and helpful. He's not only obviously well versed in just the kind of skeptical, atheistic thinking that we have been talking about and touching on, but just the whole personal experience and the personal side of it. Yeah. And I hope he re-emphasized a couple of points that we had made yesterday when we were framing this about the role of apologetics and logic in all that we're doing, right? It's not apologetics and logic per se that converts people. People are converted at the heart level, right? But apologetics and logic are important to help clear the path to that happening, right? But even when that path is clear, there's just so much. There's relationship, understanding people, understanding their lives, just so much. It's ministry, you know? It's still just ministry. And I thought it was good for Tom to do his part this morning to emphasize that before we get into what we're getting into this afternoon, which is going to be a focus more on the arguments and the logic, so on and so forth. And just to be clear, when we say arguments, there's two definitions of argument. There's the argument like getting into a fight with someone, and there's the argument which is just the practice of, constructing a logical argument, right? Premises, conclusion, which doesn't mean you're getting into a fight with someone, So when the Bible says don't get into stupid, foolish quarrels and arguments, it's saying don't let these things turn into fights, But it does say we are to demolish arguments, right? And we're to give reasons, so we can construct arguments in that neutral kind of way, not in the negative kind of way, and engage in that. And that's what we will be getting into a bit, this afternoon. And so hopefully that all makes sense, and we're ready here for what is ahead. A little bit of an overview on just atheism and skepticism as ideas. Because I know we throw these terms around. It's just important to be clear about some things. What is skepticism? The skeptic is, that goes back to sort of Greek philosophy. But skepticism, I think in a nutshell, is basically the position someone takes when they're like, convince me, right? Convince me. That's all it is. I'm open to listening, but you gotta convince me, right? We call that being skeptical. And I think it's important to understand that skepticism can be good. I mean, there is what I call healthy skepticism and closed skepticism, okay? Healthy skepticism, I would say, is something that the scriptures actually encourage. Yeah. We talk about having the heart of a Berean, don't we? Many of us, we study the Bible with people and challenge people. What is it that we tell people to do in order to have a heart of the Berean? To be eager to learn, but to do what? Go examine it for yourself and double check, right? And we praise the Bereans. Why? Because they just didn't take Paul's word for it. They went back and they checked for themselves. Now they were open, they were eager to learn, but they went back and they checked for themselves. They went back to the sources and they double checked, and we encourage that. That's what I call healthy skepticism, right? We don't want to believe anything, any old fairy tale or any old thing that comes along. You got to say, okay, I'm open. But convince me. That's good. I encourage that. I encourage that when I'm interacting with people and studying the Bible, so on and so forth. And then there's what I call closed skepticism. And closed skepticism is what again, this is sort of my loose definition here, but it's, someone who is just not convinceable. Okay? So it's just like, prove it, prove it, prove it, prove it. You know what I mean? Doesn't matter what you say or what you present, the attitude of the response is always prove it, prove it, prove it, prove it, prove it. And it's sort of this default position of skepticism. And where the problem is, it's not that you are not convinced, it's that you're not convincible. And there's a difference there, right? And my challenge to someone like that is usually, hey, why don't you be skeptical of skepticism? Right? If you're skeptical of everything, be skeptical of the position that you're locking yourself into right now if you are going to be fair and even-handed, right? Are you not convinced or are you not convincible? Agnosticism. Agnosticism is the basic position that someone takes, which is, I just cannot know, right? That's different from I do not know. I do not know, oftentimes means I just don't have enough information to make a decision. Agnosticism is I cannot know. It's different. It's I've explored, I've considered, I've looked into these things, and my conclusion is there is just not enough information or evidence available for me to decide either way. Does God exist? Does God not exist? That's sort of, I cannot know. There's not enough information or evidence available for me to make that decision. That's agnosticism. Atheism is simply defined as the absence of divine belief. We'll talk a little bit more about that, breaking that down. It's important because if, you know, when you do encounter someone who claims that they're an atheist, again, this is about being thoughtful and intelligent enough to be able to understand them on their terms, right? It's the absence of a divine belief. And it's the position, I think you'll meet very few thoughtful, well-read atheists, if you will, who will say, God definitely does not exist. Because deep down they know that's a logically indefensible position. How could you know that God does not exist? In order to say that definitively, you would have to know everything. You do not know everything. Therefore, you do not know that God definitely does not exist, right? And again, most thoughtful people will acknowledge that. So the position is, look, God most likely does not exist. And a comparison will be made to something like a unicorn, you know? Do I know for 100% certainty that unicorns don't exist? Right? No, we talk about them in books, you know what I mean? And they come up in legends and in myths, so I can't prove for 100% certainty. I haven't examined every single biological life form on the face of the planet, so I can't say that unicorns definitely don't exist, but they most likely probably don't exist. It doesn't impact my life one way or the other, you know? The absence of divine belief. Some people argue that there's not much of a difference between agnosticism and atheism. Some people will. You know, these can be flexible definitions. But overall, this group, skeptics, agnostics, atheists, they are a diverse group. There is not a one-size-fits-all. The only real common thread is absence of belief in the divine. Right? But here, atheism, though, is not technically and definitively speaking a belief or a worldview. It is an objection to the theistic worldview. Okay? There's a difference there. It is not a belief. It is an objection to a belief. Right? Like in a court of law, you know, as we've seen our law shows that we like, you know, someone sort of proposed, you know, has a witness on the stand and they're asking them, you know, something, and they say, you know, and then the other person comes up and says, I object, Your Honor, they are leading the witness, you know? They're not positing anything affirmative when they say that. They're just objecting to what's going on right there, right? And so in the same thing, atheism is just objecting to, hey, you're talking about God or gods or the divine. I object to sort of that whole worldview. And that's all that it is. An atheist, right, will have a worldview, though. Everyone has a worldview, whether they've defined it or not. This is the thing that just helps us make sense of our lives and the universe that we live in and drives our choices and our values, so on and so forth. The worldview, you know, those worldviews, but again, it's a diverse bunch. They will tend toward things like naturalism and humanism, you know, talk about, you know, maybe how evolution is sort of this lens that you can examine sort of everything through, or, you know, the human mind. And so there is something else there, right? There's not what you and I believe in terms of a theistic worldview. And a theistic worldview is simply that God or a God exists, right? The divine exists. So there's something else there. And I think this is important if we're interacting, when you're interacting with someone who is sort of, you know, a skeptic or an atheist or an agnostic, you can spend a lot of time with them sort of asking you questions and putting you on the spot about what you believe, which I think we need to feel equipped to do, but I think you're going to make, or, you know, you make progress in a conversation when you just turn it around and be like, so what do you believe, right? What is your, obviously you don't believe in God or gods or a God or any kind of God, but what do you believe? And having them articulate, so what is their worldview? What is their belief system? Because atheism, you know, strictly speaking, is not a worldview, nor is it a belief system. It is the absence of a certain kind of belief. Hopefully that makes sense. But it's an important distinction to make. Because, you know, I have had conversations with folks who are, you know, atheist or skeptical, and when I'm able to point out that I understand the difference between the two, Because they'll say, people often accuse me of, that I believe that God does not exist, and rhetorically that's in some cases an absence of belief. When I've pointed out that I actually understand the distinction, their eyes light up and they actually appreciate that. They're like, oh, okay, I'm talking with someone who sort of is understanding me now, And that's just important if you're going to have a dialogue, If you're going to have a friendly kind of conversation, as opposed to starting to lean towards those foolish quarrels and arguments that folks can get in. There is what certain observers have called classical atheism and neo-atheism. Classical atheism is focused on philosophical arguments. I don't know if you ever heard of Bertrand Russell, famous atheist from days gone by. Also Antony Flew, who was a famous atheist philosopher. He recently passed away. And in fact, there's a book up here by Antony Flew about how towards the end of his life, he changed his mind and began to believe in the existence of a divine being. But for many, many years, he wrote a couple of papers, philosophical papers that became sort of some of the philosophical foundations for atheistic arguments. But classical atheism focuses on the philosophical arguments. There is sort of a phenomenon of what many are calling neo-atheism. And the evangelists of neo-atheism, if you will, because they do act like evangelists, are guys by the name of Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and there's just a collection of books that have come out, probably in the past 5 years or so, written by these folks. And what they do, they recycle a lot of the classic arguments, philosophical arguments from atheism, but there's also an emphasis on just the perceived negatives of religion. And getting into all the bad stuff that the church has done over the years, and all the hypocrisy that religious people cultivate, and when you look at history, all the horrible things that people did in the name of God, and all the ignorance that, it's attacking the sciences, all the ignorance, that is coming into the study of the sciences when you believe in, and it's a different kind of flavor, because there's a fine line again between and Tyrone did a great job drawing the distinction out yesterday, arguments and assertions. There are arguments, philosophical arguments, but then a lot of what many of these neo-atheists have been called out on or have been accused of is just a lot of really impassioned assertions. It's like, okay, I get it, you really don't like religion, You're really annoyed by religious people, but just sort of saying that again and again is not actually an argument, But there is that some of that flavor, as has been noted in neo-atheism. So what we're going to look at right now are what I like to call God-friendly arguments. And again, by arguments, we just mean premise to conclusion, right? Not fistfights. God-friendly arguments. Let's turn to Acts chapter 17 as a moment. Paul at the Areopagus. How many of us are familiar with Paul at the Areopagus? Right. That is a picture of the Areopagus. So Paul is in Athens. He's actually sort of stranded there. He wasn't planning on going there. If you read the text, he was trying to escape from, I think, a riot or something like that. The brothers sort of dropped him off in Athens because that's as far as they could go. He's waiting there in Athens for some other brothers to meet him and pick him up. And what does Paul end up doing while he's just hanging out, wasting time in Athens? He starts sharing his faith, right? He's hanging around the marketplace, and he's meeting people, and he's talking to people, and he starts sharing his faith. It says he gets into a discussion with some philosophers. I think is it Epicurean and Stoic philosophers? Verse 18. Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to dispute with him. Right? They wanted to hear a little bit more about his views. So they invited him to the Areopagus, which was this council where religious and philosophical beliefs were studied and evaluated in Athens. And so he gets up and he delivers this message, And many of us are sort of familiar with this, and it was even mentioned yesterday by one of the students, sort of the tactic that he uses, right, when he's talking to the Athenians in the Areopagus. It says in verse 20, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Now what you worship is something unknown, I'm going to proclaim to you." And then he makes this very general argument. "The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by hands. He's not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. From one man he made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. He determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. And as some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring." He's trying to speak their language, right? "Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design. You know, in the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent." Boy, now he's introducing a Judeo-Christian idea right here, right? Repentance. "For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed." Now he's really getting to the heart of it, Jesus Christ, right? "He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead," the claims of Christ. This discussion takes a very different format here than some of the discussions that we read Paul engaging in when he goes to visit his normal place of visit. When he went on a missionary journey, what was his usual place of visit? Synagogue. A synagogue. Or he would find a place where the Jews would gather. Not every place necessarily had a synagogue. But right, and he would go in there, and so what would he, and so who was usually his audience in the synagogues? Jews and
believers,
God-fearing Greeks. Okay? So you had Jews and you had God-fearing Greeks. What that was a demographic of people. They were Gentiles, they were Greeks, but they had kind of caught on to the teachings of Judaism and the Jewish God, and they were very interested in them, and they were compelled by them, and they were intrigued by them, right? Cornelius, right, was a God-fearing Gentile. You know, they never got circumcised. They never officially joined Judaism. They didn't necessarily observe the Sabbath and the kosher laws, but they would go to the synagogue. They would hear the law being read. They would listen to the rabbis preach and teach. The point is that in those synagogues, Paul had an audience where there was already a connection with his worldview. He's speaking to an audience that already believes in one God, already identifies that one God as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, acknowledges the divinity of things like the prophets and what the prophecies say, are already very familiar with concepts like repentance, sin, righteousness, judgment, right? And so his approach is to then get into those prophecies and try to show how Jesus fulfilled those. He doesn't mention one prophecy here, does he? He doesn't quote he doesn't quote anything from Isaiah or Jeremiah, right? You know, if he did with this crowd, they'd kind of be like, who? What? You know? Like, who's Jeremiah to us? Paul had to connect with an audience where they shared very little of the same worldview, right? But he did connect with them, and he found a very general way to connect with them, to start having a dialogue, and then from there he did his best to lead that general discussion and dialogue down more specifically to the teachings of Jesus Christ. Paul has to bridge a difference of worldview and relate the gospel to an audience quite different from those in Jewish synagogues. For us, I think practically speaking, we go through that same kind of exercise when we encounter skeptics, agnostics, and atheists. Right? It's very different, and many of us are probably more familiar with and more comfortable with a dynamic where we share our faith with someone, and their response is like, "Oh yeah, the Bible, sure, yeah, I've read the Bible, yeah, hey, I've gone to church, like I'm generally speaking, I'm kind of down with that stuff, And we're like, "Oh great, we got this Bible study series, let's go through it," and we're sort of off and running, you know what I mean? And that's sort of easy and comfortable because we've just connected with someone who kind of is already generally down with the same worldview. We can start using the same terms and speaking the same language about faith and Christianity, you know what I mean, and the cross, and these things mean something to these people. But what happens when you've been out there sharing your faith, you know, and you encounter someone who's just like, God, like the Bible, I don't know, I think all of that is nonsense, to be quite honest with you. We're a little more out of our comfort zone, aren't we? You know, and we feel a little bit more like, whoa, wait, what do I do here, you know? Let me just kind of detach from this as quickly as possible and move on, you know? We can think or feel these things sometimes, and there's a sense of lostness, like, oh, I don't know where to go from here, you know? And that's the challenge ahead of us, because what we have to do is we have to bridge with someone who shares a very different basic worldview than us. And there's ways to do that, right? The way Paul found a way to do that here in Acts chapter 17. These, what I call God-friendly arguments, these are discussion points. Arguments, discussion points, where you can connect and dialogue with people who do not already share your worldview. These are things that you can throw out to someone who may be an agnostic or an atheist or a skeptic, and if they're a thoughtful one, typically they'll be happy to engage in that discussion because they're happy to engage in discussions like that, right? But these are connection points. These are arguments that demonstrate a consistency with the existence of God described by Christianity. Okay? These are arguments that logically demonstrate consistency with the existence of God described by Christianity. Notice that I didn't say these are arguments that prove the existence of God. Why didn't I say that, do you think? Based on our discussion yesterday. Because we don't know what proof means for people, you know what I mean? Some people may encounter these and it's like, oh, okay, you know, they feel like something has been demonstrated and proven to them. Others might not, you know what I mean? Like, what does it mean to prove something to someone, you know? So I think it's misleading to say, oh, there's these arguments out there that prove the existence of God. Again, we just return to the issue of proof. What's your proof? What's my proof? Who determines that standard? But certainly, these are arguments that demonstrate consistency with the existence of God, a reasonable, a rational basis, right, from just philosophical thinking that shows that, hey, see, it's plausible that God exists. And in fact, I think it's likely that God exists because of these. What do you think, right? And again, it's a discussion point. It's a way to connect. These are arguments of deductive logic. Yesterday in the debate, right, the resurrection debate, we looked at, from Mike Lacona's part, an example of inductive logic, right? Building a case, gathering evidence, coming to a probable conclusion. These are examples of deductive logic. You state premises, you have your conclusions, and if you agree with the premises, then the conclusions have to be true. Okay? A necessary conclusion. And where the good dialogue and back and forth can come, really, is then kind of talking about those premises, you know, and that's where you can get some good discussion. And agreeing on premises is key. And the basic rule of thumb is it more plausible to affirm or deny the premise? And it's true. There's something kind of gut about that. You know, but if you're able to talk and connect with someone and you guys can agree on the premises, again, it's a point of discussion. If we can agree on these premises, we can come to this conclusion together. Is it more plausible to affirm or deny the premise? So let's jump in. The first thing I want to look at is what is called the cosmological argument. And the cosmological argument it basically argues from the beginning of the universe, that the beginning of the universe itself is evidence of the existence of a divine being. And the cosmological argument works something like this. 3 very simple propositions. The first 2 are premises, the last is a conclusion. The first premise, everything that begins has a cause. Wow. The second premise, the universe has a beginning. Therefore, we must conclude that the universe has a cause. Again, if you agree with the 2 premises, you must agree with the conclusion, logically speaking. And where this gets it interesting is because then you can have a discussion to analyze the properties of that cause and assess the theological significance, and then begin to make the case that God, the notion of God, provides the best, most reasonable explanation for that cause. The cosmological argument. So let's look at those. We'll kind of then break it down here proposition by proposition. Premise 1, everything that begins has a cause. Is it more plausible to affirm or deny that? Most reasonable people will say it's more plausible to affirm that. Yeah, everything that begins has a cause. That has merit both philosophically and experientially. Philosophically speaking, there's this thing called an infinite regress. Okay? And an infinite regress is something that philosophy hates and it can't stand. Because an infinite regress is the idea that past events continue indefinitely into eternity. And the reason why that doesn't work out philosophically or logically, because then it completely makes a hash of the idea of past and present and future, right? If things continue in the past infinitely, it's not, what is past and present and future? The whole thing is muddled, right? To have a past, there must be a present, there must be a future. For the whole concept to make sense, there must be something that kills that infinite regress, a terminator, right? When we're talking about past events. So it must have begun somewhere when we start talking about the past philosophically. Experientially, that makes sense because we all understand cause and effect dynamics, right? You know, if this bottle begins to fall over, it's going to begin to fall over because of something, right? Because I knocked it over, or because somebody bumped the table, which then caused a vibration that knocked it over, right? And we kind of understand that cause and effect dynamic embedded in our experience. So it's plausible. Everything that begins has a cause. Premise 2, the universe has a beginning. And the prevailing scientific theory states that the universe has or had a beginning. We all know that as the Big Bang Theory, right? Which is the basic scientific theory that states about 13.7 billion years ago, the universe exploded into existence, generating all matter and energy in the universe. That's the Big Bang Theory, accepted virtually across the board, right? By scientists, cosmologists, so on and so forth. And there's, scientific evidence for this. Things like, being able to rate the expansion of the universe, right? It's like an explosion, If something explodes, that material will fly apart, right? And so they're able to calculate the expansion of things in the universe. Things in the universe generally are flying apart, right? And so what does that suggest or imply, right? Well, that at one point it was all together and it all blew up. Also, the presence of background radiation in the universe. Background radiation is kind of like, when a bomb goes off and it's like, right? And there's like fire and smoke, you know what I mean? That's just like stuff in the background. Well, the universe has background radiation. And that radiation is basically the universe's version of that that's still going on, right? So you have matter flying apart, and around the universe you have this background radiation, this, right? So what does that tell you? Man, the universe just exploded into existence, which means it had a beginning. Therefore, the universe must have a cause. But now the fun is, having a conversation about what that cause is, or what that cause could be, or what reasonably or plausibly it could be. Well, let's break that down. The cause would then have to be timeless, constant, and immaterial. Why would the cause have to be timeless, constant, and immaterial? Because time itself is calculated, right, as a ratio of matter and distance, and all those things came about as part of the universe, right? Without the universe, you don't have matter, you don't have distance, you don't have these things by which we calculate time. So the thing that caused before all those things came into existence then had to be timeless, right? because time is only calculated within the universe. Must be constant in the sense of unchanging. Why? Because again, change itself, by its definition, is calculated as a function of time. The way things get different over time, right? So, no universe, no time, no change, so it had to be constant, right? And immaterial. Matter is a product of the universe, right? And so again, if we define it within the universe, the thing before the universe had to then be immaterial. Something that is timeless, constant, and immaterial, because all of those things are properties that are defined only within the space-time of this universe that we know. Does that make sense?
Yep.
It had to be an agent acting freely without constraint. An agent acting freely without constraint. Because, again, if it's not, then you get back into that infinite regress. What caused the cause, right? The only thing that stops that flow of causation is a free agent, right? Something acting freely on its prerogative, so it's not part of that cause and effect principle, right? So it had to be an agent acting freely and without constraint, could do whatever it wanted or whatever it felt like doing. It had to be an idea generator with a personal dimension, something like a mind. Because again, if it's something timeless, constant, and immaterial, the best thing that we have to sort of understand that, what is timeless, constant, and immaterial is the mind, right? Ideas. Ideas are timeless, constant, and immaterial. Now I draw a distinction between the mind and the brain. Okay? Those are two different things. And that's a big philosophical argument in itself that psychologists and psychiatrists engage in. There is brain and there is mind, right? But ideas and the mind are timeless, constant, and immaterial. And if it's an agent acting freely with prerogative, well then it's personal, right? It has a personality. So it had to be some kind of idea generator like a mind with a personality, acting freely without constraint, could do whatever it wants to, making choices, that's timeless, constant, and immaterial. That sounds like the God of Christianity, does it not? Right? Now, some people might say and argue, well, you can't necessarily say that's a Christian God. Okay, well, what's in the name, right? It's a matter of, look at the descriptive characteristics, right? Okay, let's not call it God, let's call it Bob, you know? But it's still the same descriptive characteristics, right? You could change my name, people know me as Paulo, you could change my name, I would still be me, the same real descriptive characteristics, you know? Yeah. We are pointing to something that the characters best fit a divine being, or what is described in Christianity as the divine being. God is outside of time. God is constant and unchanging. God is spirit. God is love, right? God acts freely, right? The only thing constraining him is just his decision, you know, and that's not really a constraint. And nothing is constraining him. He is omnipotent, right? But he's also personal, you know? He has a mind, he has a will, he's personal. Right? And again, this is consistent with the scriptures. Yeah. Yeah. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? In the very beginning.
This is good. So how?
You know, there are some objections that have been posited. I don't think they really stand up logically. One is that, you know, some philosophers have even gone so far as to posit that, well, the universe created itself, that it's self-created. And that just, I don't know, you get into that, but it breaks down. It's just sort of a circular thing, that something can create it's self-created. No, if it's not in existence yet, it can't generate itself. You know what I mean? There's just a logical incoherence there. The whole thing begins to break down. Again, other objections, have to do with the name. Well, it's a leap to call that the Christian God. Okay, but it's pointing in that direction, right? That's the thing. We're now pointing in that direction, and we're talking about that the same descriptive characteristics associated with the Christian God fit the bill. Let's look at the teleological argument. And I believe there was a video on the website that dealt with the teleological argument. This has to do with the whole idea of fine-tuning in the universe to create life. And this is an argument, it's related to the cosmological argument, but the cosmological argument deals with, where it deals with the fact of the existence of the universe. The teleological argument deals with dynamics within the universe that lead to the development of life. And there's a lot of material out there, and including the video. But as basic a nutshell as I can put it down into, the universe operates on certain constants, right? That are just present in the universe. These are different from the laws of nature. Okay, laws of nature are those equations that you learn in a physics class. Those mathematical equations, and then we say that is a law of nature. The constant are constants that we put into those laws of nature. And some of those things are like gravitational force, right? Speed of light. Those kinds of things. There's many of them. The weak atomic force, okay? And there's lists of them. But there's all these constants. These things are just there. Again, they're independent of the laws of nature, okay? The laws of nature actually use and rely on these constants in many ways to operate and to function. They're just there, and they just have certain settings, They're just set in a particular place, and they don't change and they don't move, right? But these have all been set up in the universe, right? And there's all these different constants, around the universe. And these have been set up in such a way where it just so happens that our universe has led to the creation of planets that can sustain life, and life like us that is complex. And and so that's what I'm describing here is not so much the teleological argument. What I'm describing is fine-tuning. Okay? And so the idea of fine-tuning is basically asking the question, how is it that all these settings got set up around the universe in such a perfect way that they all converged, right, to result in the capacity to create complex life? And the teleological argument works like this. Fine-tuning of the universe is the product of chance, necessity, or design. The second premise, the fine-tuning of the universe is not by necessity or chance. Conclusion, therefore, the fine-tuning of the universe is by design. Again, if you agree with premise 1 and 2, you got to agree with the conclusion. And then, of course, that discussion about design takes you to the discussion of the designer, right? Which, again, is consistent with the characteristics of God. So, of course, the haggling and the debating and the negotiating happens around the premises, right? Premise 1, not that controversial, to be honest with you. All this premise 1 does is it just lays out the 3 possibilities, right? There's only 3. Either by chance, by necessity, or design. Premise 2 is assessing the options. On what grounds and on what basis do we dismiss chance or necessity as less plausible than design? And that's where a lot of discussion has been going on among scientists and within science and philosophers about those things. And a couple of these books over here do get into some of that material. Again, we'll try to, I'm giving you the outline of an argument. This is not supposed to be exhaustive or comprehensive, right? But this is an argument that can, again, generate some good dialogue and generate some good discussion. Let's look at number 1, necessity. So if it's by necessity, what that's saying is basically that when the Big Bang happened, there was only one setting of constants that had to emerge. It couldn't have been any other way. And in science, that's called the theory of everything. It's presenting this theory that shows why the universe is the way it is, why it had to be the way that it is, why it couldn't be any other way than the way that it is, and having all of that work together. Scientists are chasing that. That's sort of called the holy grail of science, basically. You know, and everyone wants to be the scientist that can scientifically explain the reason why everything is the way it is, right? The theory of everything. But, you know, a lot of scientists reject that. Even, a lot of skeptical atheist scientists, because the constants and quantities of the universe are independent of the laws of nature. And there's, complicated, physics and mathematics called M theory or string theory, which allows 10 to the 500, that's 10 to the 500 power. I don't even know how many, that's like a 10 with 500 zeros after it, right? Is that right? That's a lot, something like that, right? Different universes that could be governed by our laws of nature, but just with different constants, right? It's possible. It's like, it's like the volume on your TV, right? If it's sort of set somewhere, well, it could go higher, it could go, it's possible that it could go higher, it could go up to 100, right? Or it could go lower, and that TV would still operate and function the way that it does, right? And so there's universes that, that could be at least 10 to the 500 that could, basically operate, the way they do, but with different constants. It wouldn't lead to complex life, but could operate on these laws. And so just the fact of the variety is sort of says by itself, well, this wasn't the only way it could happen, right? The speed of light could have been something less than what it was, and it could have fixed there, right? Atomic force, could be something, less than, so on and so forth. There's nothing to suggest our current universe is necessary. Just like there's nothing to suggest that if you get a TV that is set at one volume setting, that it had to only be set at that one volume setting, that it couldn't be set at any other setting, right? Well, it could have been, right? So necessity, it doesn't make sense. Chance. So when the Big Bang happened, any variation of constants could have emerged, and we just got lucky, right? Any variation of constants could have emerged, and we just got lucky. It just worked out the way it was, and we're lucky that it did, that it led to complex life. The odds, and the video, I think, goes into this, mathematically are so extremely against chance that it's difficult. It's just difficult to be able to say that. It's kind of like, if a horse just popped up on your front lawn in the morning, right? And how did that get there? By chance. You're just lucky it just kind of popped up there by chance. It's like, wait, really? Like that's the way it worked out. You would immediately dismiss that, you know what I mean? But, mathematically, the chances of that being true are better than the chances that all of this, of all the possible, you know what I mean, that it just so happened to work out that way against the odds are so extreme that it kind of defies plausibility to buy into that, right? That it could have been any of these, and it just so happened, hey, it just so happened to be this one. Let's pat ourselves on the back because we just got lucky. That's not satisfying mathematically or statistically. There is one popular theory, is the multiverse theory, and that's that there are that the universe is just one universe on sort of like this foaming, expansive landscape of universes called the multiverse. And it's kind of like if you know how like in a bubble bath, you know what I mean, when you sort of pour that the stuff in there and and the bubbles start to foam up, you get this big mass of little bubbles, and some of those bubbles are expanding, and others of them are popping, and more bubbles are expanding, and others of them are popping, right? And so our universe is just like one of those little bubbles in this foaming mass of universes, and so the constants, things are all moving around because some are expanding, and some are contracting, and so on and so forth. And we just so happen to live in one of those. One of those universes. Now, Now, of course, the challenge with this is it doesn't really satisfy the argument because it just sort of, it kind of pushes the problem off and just expounds the explanatory problem, right? Because now we're not talking almost kind of back to the cosmological, if we go back to the cosmological argument, because now we not only have to account for the existence of this one universe, now you're telling me what, millions of universes? You kind of ask, well, where did they come from, right? And how did all that get started? We didn't just simplify the equation by positing the idea of a multiverse, we just expounded it infinitely, right? And the nature of a plausible explanation is that it's satisfactory and that it's believable. And there is this principle called Occam's razor. You guys, has anyone ever heard of Occam's razor? Right? There's different ways you can state it, but it's basically that, philosophically, logically, and also in science, the simplest answer is preferred to the more complex one, right? If there's a simpler answer that can be posited, prefer that one logically to the more complex one. It's kind of like a machine. The more moving parts you have, the more likely it is to break down, right? And so you kind of prefer something simpler. Well, again, this whole multiverse theory, it flies in the face of that basic philosophical principle. Because now the problem isn't just one universe and the constants of the one universe. We're now talking about millions or infinite universes, right? But how would that work, We've just pushed the problem off without actually explaining it. We've just pushed ourselves into a much bigger, much more complicated question. And not only that, but also the very simple fact that there is simply no evidence that other universes exist. There's just no evidence of it, There's Star Trek, and there's Star Wars, But in terms of someone with a reasoning scientific mind who wants good hard evidence, there is none of that. So, how plausible is that? So design. If you sort of see that necessity doesn't really fit, neither does the idea of chance, we're left with design, particularly if one can accept logically the conclusion of the cosmological argument, then design does emerge as the most plausible explanation, right? Even if you don't, you can still make an argument for design. That it is the most plausible explanation for the universe's fine-tuning, right? It accounts for the fact that it could have been a number of ways, but you escape all the messiness of having to deal with a multiverse of, some foaming landscape of millions upon billions of universes, all with different, constants and so on and so forth, without, having to imagine that, right? That uncaused cause, imagined it, willed it, designed it the way that it was. Amen. By wisdom the Lord laid the earth's foundations. By understanding He set the heavens in place. God put and set the things in the world and in the heavens the way that they are. That idea of a designer behind the fine-tuning is consistent with the description of the God in the Bible and in Judeo-Christianity. What we'll do right now is we'll take a pause. We'll take a 5-minute pause, okay? Kind of shake it off, visit the restroom if you need to, and then we'll come back for the second half. All right. So we ended off talking about the teleological argument, and I just want to reiterate that what I'm offering here is the basic framework for these arguments and these discussions. I absolutely encourage you to go back. You can find lots of material on these things. There's certain words and terms that you're not quite 100% sure that you understand. Hey, that's fine. The spirit of a student is to be eager to learn, right? But I encourage you again to put this down as this is. I'm giving you some things that you can go back home and run with, This is not exhaustive, but it gives you something to chew on, something to follow up on. Learn about these arguments, learn what people are saying, the different views about these premises. there is a good article that, you know, a good portion of this material that I use from, a pamphlet or an essay from a man named William Lane Craig. I think he was mentioned yesterday. A very, very effective apologist, William Lane Craig. And it's called 5 Arguments for God. And he does go over these, and we'll even get into a little bit more detail about some of the definitions of the terms and, you know, the alternatives, so on and so forth. I think if you just Google it, if you just Google like William Lane Craig 5 arguments, you should get a PDF file that comes up. That's something for you to follow up on, along with you know, some of these books here on the table. We'll get into some of those things as well. But we're going to move on now. And talk about, this is another argument, and this is the moral argument.
Let's go.
The moral argument. An argument based on the existence and dynamics of moral values and duties. Okay? And again, important to define the terms. What do I mean by moral? I mean anything that is associated with good and bad, or right and wrong distinctions. Okay, that's moral. Anything that we associate with good, bad, or right, wrong. Values and duties. A value is a belief. A duty is something that we need to do, right? So there's a distinction there. You know, you can have. They don't always correlate in the sense of, you know, good value and then you have to do the duty. For instance, we would say, you know, someone, hey, so you want to be a doctor, right? Anyone studying to be a doctor here? Okay, so is that, guys, will we say that that's good? Is that good that he wants to be a doctor? We say that's good, but now because that's good, does everyone now have a duty to become a doctor? Would it be wrong to then become, you know, if you weren't a, no, right? So there's a bit of a distinction there. So we talk about moral values and duties. Good, bad, right, wrong. That's what we mean by moral. Objective. What do I mean by objective? It's independent of personal opinion, as opposed to subjective. Right, which has to do with you know, someone's opinion, right? It would be subjective of me to say that you know, pepperoni pizza is better, you know, better than you know, cheese pizza, right? Subject to you know, that is a subjective point of view, right? It would be an objective point of view for me to say this pizza is composed of you know, wheat and flour, you know, water, salt, tomatoes, cheese, right? So regardless of your opinion, that is true, right? Mm-hmm. Subjective and objective. Let's look at the argument. The argument very simply breaks down like this. If objective morality exists, then God exists. Objective morality exists. Therefore, God exists. I know it's a very complicated thought process. I'm just kidding. Right? But the two premises, if objective morality exists, then God exists. If objective morality exists, then you must conclude that God exists. Again, let's talk about the premises. Premise 1. If objective morality exists, then God exists. So if we're talking about objective morality, that requires an authority that transcends humanity, right? Because human authority is either subjective or it's arbitrary, right? Human authority is either subjective or arbitrary. It's something that's either based on opinion or based on some sort of random whim, you know? You know, we can see that in societies, right? Our laws in this society are subjective, right? We just have people who opined, they offered an opinion or, you know, made assertions about, hey, let's make a law like this. You guys like it, right? And then we do something called what? Take a vote. We ask people, their opinion about that law, right, are lawmakers who get put in office based on the opinions of other people, right? And okay, yeah, my opinion, I think that would be good, so let's do it. And then bang, so that becomes a law. Now that law does become applicable to everyone, but its source is subjective, right? Because then if opinions change and you put different people in office and those people in those offices decide have different opinions, they can take that law away and change it, right? So, you know, that human authority is subjective. Or it's arbitrary, right? It used to be, think of, you know, like in some other places in the world today. Who makes the rules? Well, it's not, it is still subjective, but it's like whoever has the most guns is going to make the rules, right? It's arbitrary, okay? This group has the most guns right now, so they're going to make the rules. But as soon as some dynamic changes and this other group gets more guns than this group, well, they're going to come in and then they're going to make the rules, right? That's arbitrary, okay? But objective morality would have to transcend that to fit the definition of objective, right? Nature cannot act as an objective moral authority because moral values and duties are prescriptive while natural laws are descriptive, okay? You know what the difference between prescriptive and descriptive is? Descriptive just tells you how it is. Prescriptive tells you how it should be. The laws of nature don't tell you how it should be. We have what we call the laws of nature, but these are descriptive laws. They just tell us how it is, how it works when an object falls down or gets caught into a gravitational pull, right? It's not telling you how it should be. So nature can't act as that. Humanity can't act as the source of objective morality. So it's got to be something transcendent, God, right? As we talked about the cosmological argument, you know, that timeless, constant, unchanging, idea-generating mind, right? If that's not the best, most appropriate source of objective morality, then what would be? Okay? What is left after that as a plausible possible source for objective morality? We've eliminated the idea of nature. We understand, you know, humanity. And the funny thing is, most people will agree to this deep down. You know, oh yeah, if objective morality exists, then God, you know, then God exists. It would have to come from God. You know, people slant towards subjective morality because of this idea right here, you know? So the question is, does objective morality exist? I say, yeah, it's more plausible to say that it does than it doesn't, right? Because again, that's accepting the premise, is it more plausible to affirm or deny? Well, yeah, well, based on what? Well, we have the universal presence of good and bad values and right and wrong behaviors. Yep. Now, the actual description of what those might be might not be exactly the same across the board for all cultures and all people and all humans, but the fact that those containers exist for everyone implies, again, some sort of transcendent source for where that's coming from, right? Yeah. Some notion of good and bad, some notion of right and wrong exists in every culture, people, society that we've ever known or encountered or discovered, right? Yeah. Those definitions might not match up, but it exists, right? Yep. Evidence of a transcendent source for where that's coming from, right? Yep. Which speaks to something objective. And if you think about the alternative, what's the alternative to objective morality is subjective morality. Right? Which would be like, well, it depends. It depends on the person. It depends on their opinion. It depends on the situation. It depends on the culture. But the thing is, absolute subjective morality is logically indefensible. Because, think about this. If I stand up here and say, you know what? You have to be open-minded. It's wrong for you to say there's only one way. What kind of statement have I just made? An objectively moral statement. I just told you across the board, always in all situations, you have to be open-minded. You can't just have it one way. That's just wrong, right? Well, if that statement is true, I've just stated something that is objectively moral, right? A transcendent rule for everyone. So you see how that position breaks down, you know? Those who argue for absolute subjective morality They may say they don't believe in objective morality, but they are behaving and acting and speaking in an objectively moral way. It's inescapable, right? It's inescapable. Absolute subjective morality is a logically indefensible position, since the position itself would be an example of an objectively moral position, right? And it's, you know, it's that conundrum, you know? We don't tolerate intolerance. Right? You know? It's kind of like, okay, you know, you get it, but that's, wait, what is that? Right? It kind of breaks down on itself. So, I think it's more plausible to say that objective morality does exist. And, you know, even if you're talking to, you know, an atheist or skeptic or whatever, you know, a lot of times that if you dig deep enough and hard enough, you know, you'll get, you know, you can get anyone to admit that, yeah, there are things that are like always going to be wrong, that you always should not do, you know what I mean? Even, you know, like to, you know, just, you see an innocent child walking on the sidewalk, you know, and you pick them up and you decide to torture them to death, you know? Is anyone ever going to think that that might be right or okay in certain situations? No. No one is, you know what I mean? And so even, and so that would be something objective. Look, that's never going to be right under any circumstances in any kind of situation, right? So that would be an objectively moral situation. I see a hand up. Let's just save it because I want to. What I want to do is get through the material, release people who need to get on the road if they need to. If you want to stick around and talk more for a little informal Q&A, we can. But just hold that thought. Thanks. So objective morality exists. Therefore, God exists. And again, ironically, I think people generally do believe both of those premises, though many may attempt to fight the necessary conclusion.
Yeah.
The moral argument. Right? And this is, I think, Paul is getting at this in Romans chapter 2 when he talks about conscience, right? Indeed, when the Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law, since they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts now accusing and now even defending them, right? The operations of the conscience that are present in anyone, whether they had the law of Moses or not. There's certain operations going on that are what? Speaking to this objective morality that is sometimes accusing them, sometimes defending them. That feeling that we all have, it doesn't matter who you are or what worldview you have, everyone has feelings every now and then walking away from something where they say, I did the right thing. And everyone has that thought in the back of their mind, walk away from something where they're like, man, I messed up. Yeah. Right? It's consistent with the scriptures. The question of suffering. This is the last one we'll take a look at.
Go follow.
So this is, the question of suffering sometimes is posed as the problem of suffering. Again, there's a lot of material that is out there, a lot of pamphlets and essays and stuff. Again, what I'm offering here is not intended to be exhaustive. Again, this is just thoughts for discussion. The question of the problem of suffering that is posed, it goes something like this, and there's different variations of it. God cannot be omnibenevolent, all good and all loving, the way that the Bible claims, and all powerful, or omnipotent, as the Bible claims. Those are irreconcilable. Because if he were all good and all loving, he would not desire unjust pain and suffering to occur. If he were omnipotent, he would intervene to stop that unjust pain and suffering. But he doesn't. So God either doesn't mind or is okay allowing unjust pain and suffering to occur. And if so, he's not omnibenevolent. He's not all good and all loving. Or he does, but he's not powerful enough to intervene and stop it. Right? And if that's the case, he's not all powerful. That is, you know, that's the argument. How to answer stuff like this, or something like this. Here's a thought. First of all, it's important to, I think, understand there's a difference between an answer being logically satisfactory and emotionally satisfactory. Okay? We talked a little bit about this, the fallacy of appeal to emotion. Tom even touched on this, this morning when he said, hey, when you're interacting and talking to people, he even shared about himself, there's pain, you know what I mean? And then there's kind of explanations that you call, there's a difference between the two. No one undergoing intensely painful or intense suffering will ever be satisfied by a merely logical answer. Okay? No one. The person who is wailing over the deathbed of a loved one who just died of cancer, and when they ask, why did this happen? If the doctor comes in and starts explaining the dynamics of cancer and how that caused the body to break down, is that going to satisfy that person? No, right? The doctor can present a logical medical answer, you know what I mean? It's not going to be emotionally satisfactory. And it's important to understand that that's the case with this, right? A response, though, can logically be satisfactory without emotionally satisfying someone. It can. And so if somebody is going to present a logical argument, like I did, as to why the problem of suffering logically could not result in the existence of the Christian God, the appropriate response would be a logical one. You can give a logical answer, right? If someone is positing a problem of logic, you posit an answer of logic, but understanding that, hey, it very well may not be emotionally satisfactory. And sometimes people are asking, they think they want a logical answer, but really what they want is emotional well-being, right? And no amount of logical answers is necessarily going to help them or meet them where they're at. And it's important to understand that. But there is a logical answer to this problem, logically posed. An omnibenevolent God, a God who is all-loving and all-good, will create the best version of relational love. Because that's the definition of being all-loving and all-good, right? He's going to go after the maximum version of it, right? The best possible version. The best version of relational love is two beings freely choosing to enter the love relationship. Yeah. Right? That's plausible. Can anyone think of a better version of love than the notion of two beings freely choosing to enter a love relationship? Right? I can't. I haven't heard a better version than that. That's the version that God is after. So in order to create that, the beings must have the ability to not choose the love relationship, to satisfy that free will element. And so their interpersonal pain and suffering is simply the result of free beings choosing against the love relationship. You see how that works? Yeah. It's kind of like this, sometimes the question is, or I think of it like this, what would have been better? Would it have been better or more loving of God if He trapped Adam and Eve in paradise? Would that have been more loving of God? If He trapped them, if He basically enslaved them in paradise? You say, oh, but they'd be free from comforts and free from this and free from that. But really, would that be a better version of love than Adam and Eve freely choosing to participate in paradise with God? Which version is better? The trap or the one with the door? I think most reasonable people would obviously say, well, obviously given the choice, And particularly those of the skeptical mindset really love the idea of choice and free choice, right? And choosing, but it's interesting how that can get lost sometimes in this discussion. So some pain and suffering is simply the result of that. If you want the best version, you have to choose to be into it. By definition, you therefore have to have an option out of it. Also, very simply, good can come from suffering. That is not an emotionally satisfactory answer to people who are suffering. And we all know that. Because we've all been in situations where we're undergoing some severe sufferings and trials. and that brother or sister comes along and pats us on the back and says, hey man, you know what? Good will come from this. God has a plan. And we logically understand that and can process that, but a lot of times that does precious little to help make us feel better in the moment, doesn't it? But it's still true, logically speaking. Right? Good can come from suffering. So, God's omnipotence, He's all-powerful, enables Him to use suffering and pain to produce more good that could not otherwise exist. So if God is able to use suffering and pain to produce more good, He's staying consistent with being omnibenevolent, someone who's all good and all loving, right? Because an all good and all loving being is constantly going to try to be maximizing and generating more good and more love. So if suffering can be a tool, a temporary tool to achieve and accomplish that, He has not compromised His nature as an omnibenevolent being. And if He's using all of His power to accomplish that end, then He's working within the realms of omnipotence. So the presence of pain and suffering does not compromise attributes of omnibenevolence or omnipotence. Tom spoke to this a little bit personally this morning.
Yeah.
Remember how he said the death of his brother will always be a painful thing. And there's no getting around that for him. And there isn't. That will always be a painful thing. But he was able to adopt the perspective that good could come from that. Right? And that good has come from that. Namely for him, the journey of where he's come now to be a Christian. And so things are better off, right? It has created more good for him and his life, though that one instance will always be painful, right? That was, Tom was in the context of his own life talking about working through the problem of suffering, right? And so that's true. And you talk to people from time to time, some very inspiring stories and testimonials, and we hear them, right? People sharing in communion about trials and sufferings and things that happen, but you know what? They're better off for it, you know? We think about pain and suffering in our life, and if we understand, we don't let that compromise the notion of God being all good or God being all powerful, right? Instead, we exercise faith through those times, and then we see that come around, right? And now we're stronger, we're better off for it. We did like it when it happened. No trial or suffering is good when it's happening or when we're undergoing discipline, but in its due time it does what? Produce a harvest of righteousness. Right? And of course the Bible speaks to this again and again and again. Many passages. I just put up James 1 as one of them. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know what? That the testing of your faith develops perseverance. And perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything, right?
Yeah.
And being mature and complete is better than being immature and incomplete, right? And so God is able to use instances of suffering and trial to bring about that better good, and so we can take joy. God's omnibenevolence is not compromised, nor is His omnipotence. So some thoughts, right, to engage the problem or the question of suffering. Amen. Well, what I'm going to do at this time is just talk about some closing thoughts here. And these are closing thoughts really for the whole time, because we're about to be dismissed here in about 5 or 10 minutes. And, these thoughts are how to take everything from this past weekend and what to do with it. I talked about, hey, if there's one thing that changed you, one thing that you learned from here, then that's a success. But just some practical thoughts for what can you do with all of this. You can fashion a great Bible study from some of the things that you've learned this weekend, right? Or a pamphlet of information and just have that ready in your ministry to use in evangelism. I appreciate it. I remember at one point when I was in the campus ministry, a brother, many of us know him, Gabe Santos.
Let's go.
And I remember, I think it was him and sort of maybe someone else, but they sort of developed like just a 2-page handout of like quick facts about like the reliability of the scriptures, a couple of archaeological things, much of the stuff that Tyrone had, and just had that handy, had photocopies of that. So that way when you're going out sharing your faith and some of those questions were brought up, we can say, here, right? And just kind of hand those out to people, You can fashion a Bible study series, right? That delves into some of these things and just kind of have that on the ready, you know what I mean? It's like we have our study series, we have our primary studies, right? And then we have our secondary studies, right? And so fashioning a secondary study is an apologetics-based one, right? Or something like this about the problem of suffering. You can easily put this kind of stuff into a Bible study, right? Or the whole idea of the cosmological and design. You can fashion a Bible study out of that, right? But fashion that and use that in your campus ministry or church. Just have that on the ready, right? So when you encounter someone that has those kinds of questions or views, you can answer. You create a Bible talk series with an apologetics theme, right? You could just right here, those 4 topics I just went through. Cosmological, teleological, moral, the problem of suffering. That's a 4-part Bible talk series, right? You could fashion a discussion with some scriptures. You could advertise that on your campus, right? And that would be, I bet you that would pull in a different kind of person to your Bible talk than maybe the usual person that you're used to bringing, right? Because if your experience is anything like mine, and I think Bible talks are great, but a Bible talk tends to attract people who are already interested in the Bible.
Right.
Those are the kind of people willing to sit around for an hour and talk about the Bible. By and large, I'm generalizing. What about the people who aren't? Well, how about a Bible talk series, right, that does incorporate some scriptures, but mostly incorporates some of these things? You'd set up an apologetics event on your campus or at your church. I don't know, we've seen Doug Jacoby do these kinds of things. You could do these kinds of things, right? If you get into this material, if you pick a topic that you feel comfortable with, and you do a presentation on that. One thing that we've done at the University of Maryland a couple times is we've done something, it was sort of, I did a couple of just raw apologetics events, but then we modified them and called them a conversions forum. And what we did is invited 3 speakers, and these were, Tom Berry was one of them, another was a brother who was in the ministry who got converted from a Muslim background, and then another was Reuben Marbury, who's the lead evangelist here at the Montgomery County Church, who just has an incredible life story. When you talk about trials and challenges and pain and suffering, his life story and his conversion experience is just something phenomenal. But invited them, each one of them shared their testimony, their conversion, but in doing so, they each addressed one of these apologetics questions. Tom shared his testimony and addressed that apologetics question of coming from an atheist background. This other brother shared his testimony but addressed the apologetics question of a little bit of world religions, right? Why he converted to Christianity from the one he came. Reuben discussed his and dealt with sort of the problem of suffering. How is it that he reconciled all this pain and suffering and these things going on but ended up being a Christian and a minister? So it incorporated not just, again, the heady knowledge, trivia, fact thing, but that personal side and that personal element to it as well. When we have that event, we have different kinds of people come than the usual average attendee to a regular Bible talk. But there's different kinds of apologetics events that you can set up at your campus or at your church. Visit other student groups for dialogue or discussion. This is something that I've done at University of Maryland as well. There is, at many universities, there's probably what's called a Free Thought Society, which is just another name for the Atheist Club. But I know at the University of Maryland, these guys like to talk. I mean, they're a cool bunch. Obviously, we don't see eye to eye on a lot of stuff, but they like to talk and they like to mix it up. And at least at University of Maryland, they'll invite anyone from any background, any position who wants to come in and talk about things related to God. They'll give you the floor. And then you just talk and you have a Q&A session. So I've gone in and I basically did a presentation on why I am a Christian. And I incorporated some personal testimony. I incorporated some of the arguments or some of the things that have been presented from here. And I just did a 15, 20-minute presentation why I'm a Christian. And then we just opened it up for Q&A. And just had an interesting time dialoguing. And I had some really great conversations from there. And got to exchange info and build a little bit of a relationship with some of those folks. But this kind of stuff can equip you to visit maybe some other student groups. It could be a Free Thought Society. It could be a science club, something like that, a philosophy group. But go in there. And again, the whole idea is how can we take this to expand our evangelistic work and our evangelistic demographic. This can all be used and utilized to reach students that maybe we're not tapping or that we're not getting to, or that maybe we feel intimidated by, but breaking new ground for the gospel in the same way that Paul in Acts chapter 17 broke some new ground with the gospel there. He's not just visiting synagogues anymore. Now he's visiting the Areopagus. You know, he's not just talking to Jews and God-fearing Greeks. Now he's talking to Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. There's ground for us to make with that in our ministries and in our churches. And God willing, this weekend has equipped you, inspired you, and helped you to have a faith and a vision for breaking that ground. Amen. Last bit here before we'll be dismissed. I want some feedback from you guys, okay? This is the feedback quiz here, okay? If you could get out a piece of paper and an instrument to write with. Do those even exist anymore amongst you guys? I just see laptops and okay. All right. You still use analog devices, right? Good. Four questions here that I would like for feedback from you. So go ahead. The questions, you can see them for yourself. Please take 5 or 10 minutes to answer those, and you can just leave them, put them up here on this table. We'll make a stack up here on this table, and then we'll be dismissed. Let me say a closing prayer for us, and then you can do that, and then we'll be dismissed. Father in heaven, we do thank you for this time, Lord, and I know I'm confident that your Spirit was at work here, God, to open our hearts, to soften them, to take our thinking and our faith in new places, to strengthen some of the old places that our thinking and our faith has been in, Father. It's just my hope and my prayer, and I'm confident that we will leave here with our hearts burning and empowered, Father, and equipped to be better messengers and better heralds of the gospel wherever we go, Father. I know that there are people out there that you have thought about ahead of time that are going to be touched, that we need to reach out to, Father. I pray that we can leave with faithful and hopeful expectation, looking for who those people are, Father. That we'll be able to encourage one another and be encouraged in our hearts, giving glory to you with good news, Father, when a day from now, a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, we're going to be able to say, hey, you know, when I met so-and-so, it was great, because the conversation got started using stuff from here. We're thankful ahead of time for those victories that are about to occur, Father. And we give you all the glory, Lord. If we've been inspired, if our eyes have been opened by anything, if we've been encouraged by anything, we know that it's just been the work of the Spirit working through this time together, Father. I thank you for all of these students. I thank you for their hearts. I thank you for their faith. I pray that you will just protect them wherever they are going off to right now, Father God, and just strengthen them and be with them. And I pray that everyone here can have a safe trip home. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen.